Good afternoon, everyone. I think we've given folks enough time to log on. Welcome to our briefing this afternoon, looking at Credentials Matter. I'm Quentin Suffren. I'm Senior Advisor with ExcelinEd. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with us, we are a state and national policy and advocacy group that works with legislators, policymakers from all stripes and backgrounds, and governors' offices to promote student-centered policies, of which our work in the pathways to college and career is something that this is a piece of. So thank you. And I'm also joined by Matt Sigelman. Matt?
And I'm Matt Sigelman. I'm CEO of Burning Glass, and so great to be with you, Quentin. Burning Glass, for those of you who don't know us, is a software company that leverages the power of big data to understand the job market. We analyze millions of job opportunities every day, over 1 billion historically, and analyze tens of millions of people's career histories each year to be able to understand what the landscape of opportunity is, and specifically the skills and credentials that drive opportunity for American workers and learners.
Great, thank you. And welcome to everyone. I know that there are lots of places you can be this afternoon, and Zoom fatigue is real, so we are excited to have you with us and looking forward to a great discussion. A little bit of context about our webinar this afternoon. For those of you who may have seen our work surface last year, ExcelinEd and Burning Glass have partnered to explore and research the landscape of industry recognized credentials as it pertains to an offering at the K-12 level, typically through CTE or career and technical education programs, and as much as we can dig into the post-secondary space as well. So last year, we launched first of its kind research that looked at kind of what are the credentials that students are earning and how do they stack up in terms of what employers are asking for and in need of in terms of demand. We also did a deeper analysis in 3 states, looking at the long-term effects associated with industry credential attainment. And at the end of the day, I would just say this about our work from last year is we found out that credentials really do matter, whether it's for creating those occupational opportunities or seeing benefits associated with credential attainment down the road, everything from graduating high school on time to beginning and completing community college or an associate's degree, and even wage earnings in the states where we had data to explore. So credentials matter, but which credentials students are offered and have the opportunity to earn matter even more. Obviously, this has been a year unlike many others in recent memory, and we started this work earlier in 2019 as a follow-up to our first release, really to do a couple of things. One is expand the scope of what we were looking at and trying to collect in terms of data. And then second, we were going to dig a little bit deeper into some of the state research, again, to understand kind of these long-term effects. Then the pandemic came along, and like everyone else, we did a little pivoting. So we still did our expanded work, looking at, you know, what states are coming more online with credential data, and what does it say about student opportunities and potentials for, and the potential for states to kind of build on those opportunities or improve their policies. The second was really looking at, obviously, the pandemic hitting, and then looking at that key element or point in time where it seemed like our national economy shut down. So the span from March through May of 2020, and understanding, are there any lessons we can learn from that demand kind of total shutdown, and looking at the data and understanding it through the lens of career clusters and potential opportunities for credentialing. And then finally, we spent a lot of time redesigning the website, which I will just say up front, everything that we're going to talk about today is available on credentialsmatter.org. There is a robust website where you can explore data around specific states, specific credentials, and also kind of get a full picture of comparing what specific states are doing against kind of the national average. So just know that we don't have time to dig into all elements of data, but we are going to look at these two reports and the findings that we have kind of pulled out of them in the research. And so I'll walk through the phase 2 component. Matt's going to talk about the COVID-19 case study, and then we're going to switch to some Q&A, as we hope that this will be a discussion, not simply a presentation of findings. And when we get to the Q&A point, just know, and you can actually do this, I think, anytime, to put your questions into the chat function, and we'll pull them from there and do our best to answer as many as we can. We will keep a running log of those questions that we can't get to, and if it makes sense, we'll put out kind of an FAQ related to some of the work that we're doing. So the 2020 update, I'll start with what were we trying to pursue, and it's really the first two questions are what we did in 2019. So how many states are collecting data on student credential attainment? How are they doing it? Are there any quality concerns or any concerns in general around kinds of ways that states are either collecting, not collecting that information, and what can they do to improve? The second is that question of demand. So are the credentials that are currently being earned by students, do they carry currency with employers? And this alignment is really a function of job postings and the types of credentials that employers are asking for in those job postings. We did add a third component this year, and that is a pretty robust survey component where we asked systems at both the K-12 in states, K-12 levels and post-secondary level to produce, or at least answer, and they were very gracious to do so, a survey around the policies related and practices related to credentialing. So are there policies that support it, the attainment of it? Are there funding streams that schools, students, and families can take advantage of to accelerate or support their credentialing efforts? And we were able to collect data from 46 states on that survey for the secondary or K-12 level, and 29 states for post-secondary. So we were very fortunate to get that level of response. So what did we find? I think the easiest way to look at this is through a comparison of our phase 1 findings with phase 2. Last year, when we looked at this, 28 states were collecting quantitative data on the attainment of credentials in K-12. That has, I'm happy to say, increased to 33 states. We were able to this year get 30 states to submit data for our research. And again, I really appreciate the cooperation and assistance from state education agencies and others to do that. In terms of definitions, we found that states last year don't really have a consistent definition for what constitutes an industry recognized credential. And what that means, I'll explain a little bit later, but fundamentally it means that sometimes things that we wouldn't necessarily consider credentials are being called credentials. And that sends some mixed signals to students and families about the value of it. There's no change there. There's still a lot of differentiation across states and how they are defining credentials. Similar credentials and job listings, there's still some signaling problems in terms of what employers are asking for and whether or not those can be directly tracked to a credential. So in some cases, even jobs that would require a credential, they're not putting those credentials into the job listings as explicitly as they might. In terms of alignment, no state was, excuse me for one moment, hold on. I have a collie in the background. Sorry about that. And last and foremost, the alignment piece is that no state was highly aligned. Last year, 19% of the credentials earned by K-12 students were demanded by employers, so just under 1 in 5. That's similar to this year with 18%. So not a whole lot of change, but bottom line is there's still a huge gap between what employers are demanding and what students at the K-12 system are actually earning in terms of the supply. And then finally, we were able to capture 4 states worth of post-secondary data, which I'll talk about in just a brief couple of minutes. But I think overall, some changes in a couple of places in terms of the collection and the rate of collection, but really not a whole lot of shifting in terms of what we're seeing in terms of alignment. In terms of states collecting data on student credential attainment, we're seeing, again, those 30 states that submitted data. We have others that are expected to come online, 33 total that are saying they're doing that. Others have lists. So in some cases, they might have a list of credentials that they want students to earn, but that's just what it is. And I think one positive shift that we saw from last year is there were only a handful of states that were collecting this data from credential providers directly. So that data is of the highest quality. And that has expanded to 11. But for the most part, 22 states are still relying on self-reporting. So schools or districts reporting based on what they know and sending that in at the end of the year to understand kind of who's earning what and what that might portend. And that just raises a question of broader quality that I think more states could really take advantage of that direct relationship with credential providers. And again, the 4 states that we were able to collect data from included Arkansas, Colorado, Florida, and Utah. And I'll talk about why those were only 4 in just a moment. When we look at the types of credentials being earned by students, again, we're talking about 1.3 million, a little bit over, credentials that we had data for. They fall into various categories, and the categories are easy to understand. Some of these are self-explanatory. And they start at the top, go from top to bottom in terms of how much currency they have with employers. So how much employers actually recognize or demand or need those credentials. So a license, everything in the medical or health science cluster, those are occupations that require that license to actually operate or be employed in that sector. Certifications, which are just that. They are a range of kind of industry association mix of certifications and certificates in some cases that are directly aligned to a set of skills that a learner would need to be successful in the job. The other 3 are a little bit different and somewhat peculiar to I would say, K-12 in this instance. The first are software. These are all the productivity skills that I think we see students earn quite a bit of. The Microsoft Office, the Adobe Photoshops, all of those pieces fall into there. And they have value in the marketplace, but they are not necessarily explicitly asked for in terms of an employment opportunity. And then the last 2 have kind of the least value to employers. They're these general career readiness, basic first aid, OSHA 10 hours. They might serve as building blocks, but that is something that it's a big question as if they are, right? But by themselves, they are not necessarily going to make someone more employable on their own. And then finally, CTE assessments. We had a couple of states that are, we would argue, are kind of conflating a curricular component with a credential in this instance. So it's an assessment. It might serve and be valuable in terms of understanding how well a learner has mastered certain content in a course, but they're not something that an employer would actually recognize or know about. And I think the big takeaway is that at the K-12 level, upwards of a third fall into those areas of CTE assessment, general career readiness. So that's a third that really it's hard to say whether they have any value at all, other than if you can determine whether they're linked with something else. And that linkage is just really not evident to us right now. So again, what does this mean in terms of demand? Again, we are kind of back at this. Less than 1 in 5 credentials have currency with employers. And I will say 2 things about this demand. That they are, one is a reminder that they do come directly from job postings at the state and regional areas. And 2, when we talk about this notion of demand, we did incorporate a wage threshold for credentials, to the point where we did not count those credentials that were not aligned to an occupation that paid at least $15 an hour. So when we think about demand, it's not just about what employers are asking for, but it is also that value proposition about, does it pay? I mean, we could argue whether that's a living wage or not, but does it pay a wage that at least has some sort of premium in the market? And in that case, that's another critical issue that we found, is that it's not that sometimes the credentials aren't necessarily, they're being earned, or they might be asked for in some instances, but they're not aligned to a wage that would be reflective of an education to workforce system, rather than just get folks into any kind of job approach. So what's behind in addition to kind of the wage component, what's behind this misalignment? It's really a story of oversupply and not tracking with what is being demanded. So this is nationally, so that for those 1.3 million credentials that we had data for, the top 10, 6 of the top 10 are really oversupplied, i.e. that means employers aren't asking for them in the number that students are earning them, or they're really not necessarily asking for them at all. So things like basic first aid, things like the Virginia Workplace Readiness Skills for the Commonwealth, that is a state-created certificate to help students kind of check a box that they have for graduation requirements. So there are lots of different reasons why you can see this oversupply, but in many cases it is just because they're earning things that either aren't recognized by employers, or they just don't have that level of wage earning. And similarly, you can see the top 10 credentials that are in demand, that only 3 in terms of the significant numbers of student attainment there, or credential attainment, actually fall into those top 10. So there's a mismatch here, and I think it is one that we saw last year, but given that we collected almost double the amount of credentials and we expanded the number of states, it was a little bit worrisome to us to see this similar story play out elsewhere. In terms of post-secondary data, I will just say that the 4 states that we have them, we were very appreciative, but it was really a story about the challenges in collecting them. And they're threefold. One, an issue of most post-secondary institutions are more concerned with coursework than credentials. So they might know a student attended a class on welding, but they don't know whether or not they actually earned the credential associated with it. In some cases, it's just partial data. They don't collect that level of data in any kind of aggregate form. And as we all know, just the silos across post-secondary systems, there's typically only a few states that have kind of a robust, post-secondary board of regents or department that would seek to collect that in aggregate. That said, the credentials that are at the post-secondary level are more aligned with employer demand, and that's a large part because they are falling into those other 2 categories, right? The license and certifications, things that you would see like a paramedic or a registered nurse. These are the kinds of programs that are more likely to offer credentials at the post-secondary level. In the 4 states, though, I will say there was a variation. So the state that was most highly aligned had about 66% or 2/3 of its credentials aligned at the post-secondary level with employer demand, while the lowest was around 1/3. So there's still a fair amount of differentiation even in the 4 states, but I do want to caution it's just 4 states. So we're not extrapolating anything other than there's variation, but overall there's also a kind of consistency that of the types of credentials they're earning, and in general that they are more aligned. So in terms of recommendations, I think we've learned quite a bit over the past couple of years, and it really falls into kind of some core areas and a bedrock of clearly communicating the value of credentials across sectors and audiences. And this is something that involves not just the education providers or agencies, but also employers, post-secondary institutions, but to understand what's there and and what actually is valuable. And that's something every state's going to have to dig into on their own. It is not a one size fits all. But bottom line is that value component is critical. The second and third are really around what is a credential, and do you know whether or not folks are earning them? I mean, these are the kind of core issues around just transparency. And when we see a lot of folks, especially now in light of the pandemic, wanting to kind of create new programs, dig into, try to find solutions. And we would say, yes, absolutely, but know what you have first, and know whether or not these are things that are going to actually carry that value proposition to its end. The data quality component around where folks are getting the data, how rigorous that is, and what can be done. And then the reporting. A lot of this data across states sometimes is public, sometimes it's not. And I would say a big concern of ours is that families and parents and students really need to have this data at their fingertips, or at least be more acquainted with it so they can understand a little bit more about the decisions they might be making. And that gets directly to the access and equity of that, empowering students, families, and educators to really know what's going to make the difference for learners. So with that, I'll pause, and Matt, feel free to move forward with a COVID case study.
Perfect. Quentin, thank you so much. And what I take away from the research that you just presented that we did together is, that even coming into this pandemic, and the pandemic has been so transformative, as we all know, but even coming into this pandemic, we were in a system where, on the one hand, I think a resounding takeaway from what you just presented is the imperative and value to students associated with having credentials in unlocking opportunity and enabling students to enter the job market, whether they're going directly from high school, whether they're going into the job market with a college degree, or anything in between, but as a way of being able to validate the skills they have and being able to launch successfully. On the other hand, what I also took away is that across the universe of states, and even where there is data today, we have a long way to go, pretty much everywhere, before we get to an ecosystem, education ecosystem, where we are producing the right kinds of credentials, where there's good alignment between the credentials that unlock opportunity for learners on the one side, and the credentials that students that we're producing. So a good amount of lack of alignment in both cases. So what I'd like to do now is to actually talk about, so if that's sort of the environment that we were coming into the pandemic with, it would be the understatement of certainly the hour, probably the day, more likely at least a month, to say that the pandemic has fundamentally transformed the opportunity landscape for graduates. We now have a much more competitive landscape than we've ever had. Obviously, students are competing not only with one another, but they're competing for fewer jobs, and they're competing with 40 million people who have been cast onto the sidelines by this pandemic. It's a very challenging maelstrom for students to be graduating into. And so the question is, how specifically has the pandemic reshaped the demand landscape for credentials? How can credentials, on the one hand, which credentials have become more or less valuable, and which careers represent more or less opportunity than they did previously, and finally, what are the factors of this COVID world which should change how we think about opportunities for students, and therefore which credentials will give them mobility and entrance. So let's go on to the next slide. We looked at a couple of things here. What we wanted to do, obviously, overall, was to understand, and we undertook this in the midst of the severity, the most severe parts of the decline. But that said, if you were to update this to current day, you would see that these trends have very much continued. Percentage changes have changed slightly. But overall, a lot of the kinds of jobs that decline, the kinds of jobs that actually prove more resilient have stayed in place. So our first thing was just to understand the change in that demand landscape and to understand it by a couple of different slices. We wanted to look at occupations themselves. What are the jobs that represent good opportunities? What are the jobs that no longer represent good opportunities that maybe previously did? But also we spent a lot of time thinking about career clusters. The next few analyses that I'll share with you are based on career clusters because that allowed us to look at both, how big is a given career cluster as an opportunity area, what percentage of jobs are in a given state or in that cluster, to look at the feasibility or the accessibility of that cluster to people without a degree or people with a degree, but to understand the breadth of accessibility across levels of educational attainment, and to also understand whether a given cluster had a healthy credentialing ecosystem. Employers look for credentials as a token in those kinds of careers. And within each of those occupations, within each of those clusters, then looking at credentials themselves, we then looked at a few different forces that we thought could be reshaping the environment. How automation prone are that? We know that the pandemic in general has been accelerating a lot of trends toward automation. How much physical proximity is involved in those occupations in a world where we're all socially distanced, and also to what extent do these kinds of jobs, do these credentials open up, or these career clusters include a lot of employment for critical workers in the kind of roles that have proven to be most resilient through the pandemic. And we'll go on to the next page. So as you can see, overall, again, big drop in demand, and that has persisted. We're up a little bit from the trough where we were in May, but still the job market is very significantly down, not only in terms of the unemployment trends that we tend to see more often in the paper, but in terms of the opportunity trends, what kind of jobs are still posting, what kind of jobs are still in demand. We'll keep going. So looking here more specifically by career cluster, you can see, notwithstanding you have, a significant drop overall, the level of drop in demand varies considerably by career cluster. And you can get to something from the education industry or construction industries, agriculture, which have all been fairly consistent in their demand. Certainly transportation has been significantly less impacted, to fields like business jobs, arts and communications jobs, which have actually seen significantly greater impacts to the demand landscape. And again, some of those have continued to persist. And so that speaks to how this is reshaping. If we go on to this next page, what we see is that in each of those career clusters, you also start to look at some of the factors of how much critical worker designation there is. And here again, you can see literally, in some cases, a threefold difference between the percentage of workers in a given field, like, again, arts and communications, where only about a third of workers are considered critical workers, to a number of them like IT or healthcare, where a very high percentage of workers have critical worker designation. We also looked at this question of physical proximity score. And here again, significant sets of variances from fields like health science to a lot of human services, which are, let's face it, significantly dependent on proximity, right? If you're a phlebotomist, you're getting next to somebody, just either that or using a really long needle. On the other hand, a number of other occupations like those in agriculture, a number of ones in finance, where it's much easier to be physically distant. We bring up these sets of factors because, again, I think really mostly to be suggestive of the ways in which the job market is reshaping itself. And that sort of speaks to the here and now of how that job market is reshaping, but we're also very sensitive to how the job market is being reshaped into the future. And so that's why we also looked at this question of automation risk. Automation isn't something that will necessarily be happening, or it's been accelerating, but the displacement of automation, its real bigger risk is not this month or next month, as some people project that we may see another uptick in cases or whatever it may be. But this is going into the post-COVID world. As employers start to hire back people, we know that employers don't always hire back the same workers they let go, and they often are reticent to hire back at all and start to preference automation in place of hiring. And so one of the things that also is important to look at is not only key pandemic-related factors like proximity, like critical worker designation, but to look as well at, in the future, how prone are roles in that field to be automated? Because we know that the pandemic has changed that proclivity to automate, the propensity to automate in a very significant way as well. And here again, no surprises, but I think a really important and suggestive analysis about what career clusters we should be helping students prioritize, and therefore what kind of credentials are going to be most effective in helping students not only land into careers, but land into careers that will give them upward mobility and future readiness. So, I think just that speaks to a couple of implications here. By the way, I think as we talk about this, this says, first of all, we have to look at all these kinds of questions, that looking at the data that may have been there, or the standard ways we've been evaluating credentials in the past may no longer apply. And so we need to actually take a data-driven approach to reevaluating which careers that we're helping students prepare for, what skills they're going to need in those careers, and therefore what credentials. It's also relevant, by the way, to look at remote work, both in terms of how that changes the landscape, both negatively in some cases, but in many other cases positively, and the kind of opportunities that starts to open for students who may be, for example, in rural environments, which previously haven't had access to high-tech careers and other kinds of careers that have tended to concentrate in urban hubs, but which they may now have access to, and how does that therefore change the relevance of certain credentials in those cases as well. So just wrapping up, things that we took away from this analysis are, one, how important it is to be data-driven in a rapidly changing world as we all try to master a new physics of the opportunity landscape, and therefore evaluate what credentials continue to be in demand, what credentials that may be acquiring new value, and which credentials may no longer be relevant. Second, it is similarly an impetus for us to reassess the career pathways, to understand that some of the pathways that previously were relevant may no longer be. And I think it creates an imperative to make sure that we are continuing to align learning with demand and with opportunity. Because, at the end of the day, there's in some ways sort of, I think of this as a Hippocratic oath in a way, right? We want to, first of all, do no harm. We help students acquire credentials for fields where there are no good opportunities, or where opportunities may be going away, or may no longer offer mobility, and we may have done harm. And number three, I think the key takeaway here is how important this is, not only for policymakers and educators to have these data, but for us to empower students and their families with those same data, to democratize the data, so that students and their families can make informed decisions about the career areas that are likely to offer opportunity, and the skills and credentials that will help them unlock them. Back over to you, Quentin.
Great, thank you. And I mean, I think one thing I would just add before we move on is, and it feels like, given that 18% number that we talked about in terms of demand, coupled with some of these big changes, particularly related to automation, which in many cases we're hearing industries is not because they don't know how to do it. They just haven't done it because the labor market's been pretty tight. They haven't had to spend those dollars. It feels like this is kind of doubling down on some of the urgency to really reassess career pathways, not just from the COVID lens, but from the standpoint of how people might be working going forward, whether it be remotely, whether it be navigating that balance between kind of the more durable occupations in the future and some of the potential health risks or other risks that come with those job opportunities. But thank you, Matt. And I'd love to, before we transition to the Q&A section, I just want to remind folks that, and we won't do a demo on the call today, but just want to remind folks that all this information, the reports that we just spoke about from phase 1, from phase 2, and we've given you, I think, a small taste of what's there. All of this is available at credentialsmatter.org. And I bring that back up because it does provide all of the data we collected from those over 1.3 million credentials, all from the states, the gracious responses we got from folks on the surveys. It's all embedded into the site in terms of specific and customizable reports with recommendations based on specific states. So just not so much a plug, but just a reminder that what we've provided is kind of scratching the surface today, with the standpoint that, you know, we want to start a conversation, but we hope that you will engage with others and take that further on your own. So I'll stop our share for the moment. Before I open it up to the Q&A in the chat, Matt, while I have you, I did want to kind of follow up on a thread that you were talking about. And, you know, we hear a lot about credentials tied to occupations, you know, as demand for those occupations suffer during this pandemic. Are there different types of credentials or certain, you know, bright spots that you see that are emerging that, you know, schools, providers, others might want to consider in the credentialing landscape that maybe haven't gotten as much of the headlines in the past?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it speaks to the interplay of those three factors we were talking before about, on the one hand, automation risk on physical proximity and critical worker designation on the one side, and then growth on the other. I think we are seeing a reshaping landscape. And there are certain kinds of occupations that I think are coming to be, you know, are seeing very strong demand, and where we can help students enter in quickly and potentially move up. As an example of that, you know, pointed out a few minutes ago, the strength of demand in the transportation sector. And, you know, certainly if we continue to see the robust demand for transportation, that's not only the licensure associated with driving and other kind of delivery occupations, but perhaps better paying and more consistently things like NASE Tech certification continues to be a very strong option. I think you would see similarly, you know, again, when you look at occupations which have low automation risk, low physical proximity, high percentages of critical workers, you would certainly look at healthcare, strong demand for people with whether it be a CNA certification, but also paramedics with EEG, ECG, EKG techs, all being, I think, you know, strong. And then, of course, it's hard to avoid thinking about IT. You know, on the one hand, there's been a significant slowdown in new hiring in the IT sector. On the other hand, we know that coming out of the pandemic, there's likely to be actually an acceleration of demand for the same kind of data and digital skills that were red hot coming into the pandemic. That as workers and again as employers hire back people. They're going to hire people with those sets of skills. And so even jobs like the help desk and therefore getting things like A+ certification or Security+ certification are really important things to think about. Microsoft Technical Associate certification, all things that I think have a good amount of resilience and significant value that, to your point earlier, have been going significantly undersupplied.
Great, thank you. We are getting some questions in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and shift to the first one that we have. And this relates to the collection of data by states and in the different areas. And it's asking, did surveys suggest any barriers or burdens for states to collect the relevant data? Or is collecting the data essentially the low-hanging fruit that any state could easily do at a low cost through policy or legislation? I mean, I'll tackle this one first. I mean, please weigh in on your side, Matt. But I mean, I think low-hanging fruit, we would argue that is a great term for what we're seeing here in terms of data collection. And it's twofold, right? One is the collection itself, just, whether it's through legislation or policy, deciding to figure out what is out there and asking for that data. I think the second piece is being able to place that data collection in the context of the why, right? And both of these are not high cost issues, right? But I think it's, what are you trying to accomplish with this data collection? I mean, obviously, we're putting out there what we hope is a kind of a view of the conversation right now and how we, would hope people would pick up on it. But yeah, policy and legislation, and we've seen it in states over the past few sessions where states are asking folks to, collect information around not just credentials, but broader CTE outcomes at both the K-12 and post-secondary levels. And these they do take some time and effort, but you don't need a brand new shiny longitudinal data system to do this. You don't need a huge dashboard or anything like that to do this. It is really articulating the purpose and the will and just the definitions and kind of criteria that you want folks to be reporting on.
The only thing I would add there, I think, as you said, the term low-hanging fruit is always relative. Nothing's ever completely easy. But that said, I think you're exactly right that a lot of this really comes down to less systems change, less infrastructure change, and more developing some basic processes that are designed to change culture. What we're talking about is developing a data-driven culture where instead of credentials being selected on an impressionistic level or based on a chat with a couple of employers who happen to be at the donut breakfast, or instead of picking credentials based on lobbying activity, you simply say, hey, look, in order for us to underwrite a credential as a state or as a school system, we're going to expect an evidence of demand. And here's how we're going to define demand. Something as simple as asking that question can be really transformative. The data are available. They're easy to get, kind of stuff that we do. But it just, I think if we start asking that question and putting those kinds of rubrics in place, then states and policymakers, education systems can start to develop a level of maturity in terms of what kind of questions they ask and what kind of scrutiny they apply.
Great, thank you. Yeah. A second question we have is really around specific, I think it gets to, it's asking about a specific credential in terms of demand, but I think it can be extrapolated to some other ones as well. But it's asking how did this report determine a credential's level of demand? For instance, NCCER core is listed as very oversupplied, but is viewed as the gateway credential to multiple skilled trade credentials. And they prepare young people for careers in skilled trades. And there's a question around, how is that going missed in some of our analysis? And again, I'll open it up. I think there's two things here. It is that sometimes what employers are asking for is not necessarily directly correlated to what providers are giving. And by that, I don't necessarily mean they're not useful in terms of skill acquisition and so forth, but there's an issue of employer signaling. And what we are showing you can take away as one, NCCER is not something that employers are strongly signaling as far as jobs posting. And that's not a judgment call on our part. That's just kind of what we're seeing. So that's a piece of it. I think the other thing is NCCER, and there's some other ones. I think some of the assessments, there is a blurry line sometimes between broader curricula and credentials that are actually being asked for employers. And so I think that is NCCERs, and there are a few others, ACT work keys, all sorts of things that they kind of fall into those areas where we're not arguing whether they have value or not to states or to learners. There are lots of different reasons that folks engage those organizations, they engage those credentials or use them, but it's worth a really serious conversation as to, how you're defining credential and who's actually signing on to that definition.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that's both those points are exactly right. Look, at the end of the day, first of all, it's worth sort of going back to how we looked at credentials. We said credentials either represented or either aligned. The credential itself was in demand, or the credential was directly aligned to a specific occupation or skill that's in demand. There are a lot of credentials out there that, to Quentin's point, represent a good curriculum as a baseline and may have some level of utility, but we need to be clear with ourselves when that's what we pay for, that credential in itself will not help a student get a good job. I think as the questioner put it, it's a gateway. So that credential plus some other credentials in specific trades will get you into a job. But unfortunately, what happens with a lot of those kinds of core capability credentials is that we can, a lot of systems help students acquire those credentials and say, great, job well done. We helped somebody get a workforce credential, and we've accomplished what we set out to. And unfortunately, the student isn't quite there and is left short of the line. So as long as those credentials are being complemented with ones that have specific value to specific, either because employers ask for it by name or employers have high demand for the specific jobs or skills that those unlock, then it's unless we're doing that, then we haven't gone all the way that we need to go. I also just want to highlight the point you made to start, Quentin, which is that look, this also speaks to the imperative for employers to do a better job of signaling. If there are sets of skills that are valuable to employers, they are going to be able to say, look, we need people with those sets of skills. They need to start using a credentialed vocabulary because otherwise it's not going to send the signal to policymakers and educators that they need in order to know that that's a credential of value.
Yep, absolutely. It's a great question, though, and one we get quite a bit. In terms of other questions, it says one is, do we offer a definition of credential in reports at all? Our report from last year, 2019, we go into a huge section around the definition of a credential as we view it. I will say that different states define credential differently. And so there are some states that take a very rigorous approach in terms of it can be only a nationally or internationally accredited association or business group that gives it. But I think if you go back to our report one from last year in 2019, we kind of lay that out. I think in this research, though, we're not necessarily trying to tell people how to define their credentials as much as we are trying to expose kind of the variation of it and the fact that variation can cause problems when it comes to that alignment component, or just to Matt's point that whether or not we may think a credential is known to employers, but it's not, or employers may be thinking they're signaling for something that relates to a credential and they're not. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that Matt, but next question, and I know we're about 9 minutes left, so thank you for presenting these. It says, will this data put pressure on districts to provide credentials and apprenticeships for students? I don't think the data alone will provide that pressure, and I don't think that's our intent is to start these conversations and really, I would say from the ExcelinEd standpoint in our policy work with states is first and foremost, know what your current programs are actually producing. And in coupling with that, establish a clear vision for what you expect them to produce. And I think this research and others is not so much you should go chasing after this credential or that credential. It's more around there is a mismatch between these two pieces. And does your state, has it taken the opportunity to establish a clear vision, clear definitions, and then does it know writ large, how successful current programs are at meeting that vision? So I think there's certainly an opportunity for states, schools, districts, anyone to look at this data and start to raise those questions and understand it in the context of their kind of local situations.
I would simply add that from my perspective, this isn't so much about creating pressure to credential students so much as it is for me about making sure that that we're providing the right ones. I go back to the Hippocratic Oath that we were talking about before. Let's make sure that if we're going to make those kinds of investments, and states are spending so much money and rightly on CTE programs, how do we make sure that we're using that funding to the greatest possible effect, both for students and for their communities? And so the questions of alignment are really designed to create the kind of framework for helping assess which credentials are likely to be of high impact. The other thing I would point out here is this. Underlying the question of does this put pressure on them to do it is in some cases a view of whether, an either or view of whether we're providing students with an academic education or whether we're providing them with a career education or what used to be called a vocational education. And I think a key premise behind all of this research is the view that actually no matter whether a student is in a college-bound track, whether alternatively she's likely to go straight into work, skills and credentials are key to helping them to enter into and move along a successful career over time. And so this doesn't need to be an either or.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's an opportunity here, and that I think that there might be pressure to take advantage of it, given where state economies are. But I think ultimately it's an opportunity for discussion and really understanding and thinking about where you want to see your pathways go in terms of offerings for students. There's a question about whether we will share the slides. Yeah, I think we're happy to share the slides after this. Let's see, any other questions that have come up? Sorry, I'm just scrolling through the chat. All right, I think we have done our part. I don't know, Matt, is there anything else you want to say before we close or emphasize?
The only other thing I would just say is that we've laid out some of the kind of factors in terms of that may be reshaping the opportunity landscape for students. We talked about automation. We talked about physical proximity. We talked about critical worker designation. and we talked a little bit about remote work, but I sort of think more, one of the things I would encourage people to do is to think more broadly and think ahead to what are the kind of forces that are likely to reshape the demand landscape, the opportunity landscape in your area, because all jobs are local, beyond the kinds of things that we've talked about here. For example, Burning Glass has been tracking the emergence of 4 key forces of 4 economies, if you will, that we think are going to shape the world of work in the post-COVID economy. A remote economy, an automated economy, a logistics economy, and a readiness economy. And each of those has certain sets of jobs and skills that will likely come into high demand. As an example, in the readiness economy, Thomas Friedman from the New York Times likes to refer to COVID-19 as being not a black swan event, i.e. the kind of event that you can't predict, but as being a black elephant event. Kind of thing, it was always the elephant in the room that none of us was paying attention to. Now, of course, we all are paying attention to it, and governments and companies are starting to think about readiness for things like cyber attacks, for physical vulnerabilities in infrastructure, for other health events, potentially for environmental catastrophes, in ways that they hadn't necessarily been thinking about before. And underlying that, there'll be certain sets of jobs, certain sets of careers, and certain sets of skills that will become more and more valuable. And so I think if you can think ahead to those, think ahead to what kind of opportunities that may open for your students, and therefore what credentials will help those students become, enter into those kind of careers to have resilience in those careers over time. I think that's also going to be a key part of how we think about the relevance of credentials going forward.
Great, thank you. And I would just add from our end that, we are first and foremost an organization that works with states. So as you think about the policies that might be applicable, or if you want to dig in and understand kind of what are the opportunities that are really applicable or relevant to your state where it currently sits, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. My email is quentin@ExcelinEd.org. So feel free to reach out and to us or to our advocacy team, but you can reach us at ExcelinEd.org as well on our website. But bottom line is we want to help you if that's something that your state is interested in, and we're more than happy to kind of unpack this in a way that makes sense for your context. So Matt, always a pleasure to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today. And big thanks to all the folks who joined us as well. Again, more to explore and more to talk about on credentialsmatter.org. But thanks again, everyone.